The rumble of tank treads against asphalt shattered the morning quiet of Riverside District, sending vibrations through apartment windows and into the hearts of sleeping families. Children pressed their faces to glass, watching olive-green behemoths lumber past their homes while their parents reached for phones, desperate to understand why their neighborhood suddenly resembled a war zone. Social media exploded with grainy videos and frantic questions. "Civil war starting?" One post read. "Martial law declared," asked another. The truth was far more insidious. Just 12 hours earlier, Marcus Williams had been arranging boxes of canned goods in the warehouse that served as Hope Community Food Bank, humming gospel hymns while volunteers streamed in for another day of feeding their neighbors. The converted industrial space buzzed with purposeful energy as dozens of Black volunteers, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers, sorted donations and prepared for the morning distribution that fed over 3,000 families weekly. "Marcus, we got twice as many families signed up today," called Keisha Thompson, a social worker who coordinated volunteer schedules. Her voice carried across the warehouse as she balanced a clipboard against her hip. "Food stamp cuts got people desperate." "Then we'll make it stretch," Marcus replied, his weathered hands continuing to stack cans with methodical precision. At 62, he had transformed from auto mechanic to community pillar after his plant closed, channeling decades of organizational skills into feeding the hungry. Been doing this for 8 years. Never turned away a family yet. The food bank occupied a former textile factory in the heart of Riverside District, a predominantly Black neighborhood that had weathered economic storms with remarkable resilience. Marcus and his team had converted the cavernous space into an efficient distribution center, complete with refrigeration units for fresh produce and a small office where families could access additional social services. Local churches, businesses, and even suburban donors had rallied behind their mission, creating a lifeline that extended far beyond simple food distribution. By 7 a.m., the line outside stretched 3 blocks. Families arrived with children in strollers, elderly residents leaning on walkers, and working parents who had taken precious time off to ensure their households had enough to eat. The atmosphere was community-focused and orderly, with volunteers directing traffic and offering coffee to those waiting in the unseasonably cold morning air. Karen Whitman sat in her silver BMW across the street, engine idling as she watched the growing crowd with mounting irritation. At 47, she managed a successful real estate firm and prided herself on being a problem solver. The presence of so many people in what she considered her neighborhood, despite living 15 minutes away in an upscale subdivision, triggered something dark within her sense of control. "This is ridiculous," she muttered into her phone, speaking to her sister Rebecca. "I can't even get to my client's house with all these people blocking the street. Don't they have jobs?" The irony was lost on Karen that many in line worked multiple jobs, but still struggled to afford groceries, or that the food bank operated specifically to serve working families caught in the gap between employment and livable wages. Her worldview allowed for no such complexity. When a volunteer approached her car window to offer directions around the crowd, Karen's frustration crystallized into something more dangerous. "Ma'am, if you need to get through, Elm Street's clear just 2 blocks over," said David Martinez, a college student volunteering between classes. His tone was respectful and helpful. "I shouldn't have to detour around this chaos," Karen snapped, rolling down her window completely. "This is a public street, not a homeless camp." "It's just a food distribution, ma'am. We'll be done by noon." "I've seen enough," Karen interrupted, rolling up her window and reaching for her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed 911, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of what she was about to do. The emergency dispatcher answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? Karen took a breath, then spoke with calculated urgency. I need to report an armed militia group that's taken over the 1400 block of King Street in Riverside District. There are dozens of them, all black males, and they're blocking traffic and intimidating residents. I saw at least 3 with weapons, and they're becoming increasingly aggressive toward anyone who tries to pass through. Ma'am, can you describe the weapons you observed? Handguns. Definitely. Maybe rifles. I couldn't get close enough because they surrounded my car and started shouting threats. I barely escaped. Please hurry. They're talking about taking back the neighborhood and other extremist language. Every word was a fabrication, but Karen delivered them with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed her inconvenience justified any response. She provided additional false details, claims of suspicious vehicles with out-of-state plates, mentions of coordinated communication devices, and insistence that the situation was rapidly escalating toward violence. Within minutes, the 911 call had triggered emergency protocols designed for domestic terrorism threats. The dispatcher alerted police supervisors, who contacted federal authorities, who in turn activated National Guard units stationed 30 miles outside the city. A web of communication spread Karen's lies through law enforcement channels with frightening efficiency. At the food bank, Marcus noticed the first police cruiser arriving around 8:30, then another. By 9 a.m., the street swarmed with law enforcement from multiple agencies, their vehicles forming a perimeter that effectively trapped everyone inside the distribution area. "Sir, I need you to step away from the building," commanded Officer James Patterson, his hand resting on his service weapon as he approached Marcus. "Officer, I'm Marcus Williams. I run this food bank. Is there some kind of emergency?" Marcus kept his hands visible and his voice calm, drawing on decades of experience navigating interactions with law enforcement. "We've received reports of armed individuals threatening civilians in this area. I need everyone to move back while we assess the situation." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Armed individuals, officer. We're just distributing food to families. We have permits, insurance, everything legal and documented." But Officer Patterson was already speaking into his radio, calling for additional backup as more families arrived for their weekly groceries, unaware they were walking into what law enforcement now considered a potential combat zone. The situation escalated rapidly. A SWAT team arrived, followed by federal agents, followed by military vehicles that seemed absurdly outsized for a food distribution. The National Guard deployment included armored personnel carriers, tactical units, and enough firepower to suppress an actual uprising. Colonel Sarah Chen, commanding the Guard response, established a command post in a parking lot 2 blocks away. A career military officer with combat experience in Afghanistan, she found herself applying counterinsurgency tactics to American civilians waiting for groceries. Intelligence reports indicate organized militia activity with potential for coordinated violence. She briefed her team leaders. "We're treating this as a domestic terrorism incident until proven otherwise. Rules of engagement are defensive, but prepared for rapid escalation." The families in line watched in growing terror as their neighborhood transformed into a militarized zone. Children cried as soldiers in full combat gear took positions behind barriers and vehicles. Elderly residents who had come for basic necessities found themselves caught in what appeared to be a siege. "What's happening?" asked Gloria Santos, a grandmother who had brought her 2 grandchildren to help carry groceries. "Why are there soldiers?" "I don't know, Abuela," her teenage grandson replied, pulling out his phone to record the surreal scene. "This is crazy." Social media erupted as videos spread across platforms. Riverside siege began trending within an hour, accompanied by speculation ranging from terrorist attacks to foreign invasion. The actual truth, families seeking groceries, seemed impossible to believe, given the military response. Marcus attempted to explain the situation to increasingly skeptical authorities. "We have documentation for everything we're doing here. Community partnerships, health department permits, insurance certificates. This is a licensed food distribution serving registered families." "Sir, we're going to need you to provide a complete list of everyone present, including volunteers and recipients." Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit informed him. "We're also suspending all activities pending a full security assessment." The implications hit Marcus immediately. "Agent Torres, stopping our distribution means 3,000 families don't eat this week. Many of these people depend on us completely. Please, let us at least finish serving the families already in line." "That's not possible. This area is now under federal security protocols." As word spread that food distribution had been suspended indefinitely, desperation began replacing confusion in the crowd. Parents who had counted on this weekly lifeline faced the reality of empty refrigerators and hungry children. Some families had traveled from across the city, using gas money they couldn't afford to lose. "My kids ain't eaten since yesterday," called out Tamara Johnson, a single mother holding a crying toddler. "Y'all gonna feed them if you shut this down?" Her question cut through the military precision surrounding them. Soldiers trained for combat found themselves facing desperate parents, not enemy combatants. Several Guard members visibly struggled with the disconnect between their mission briefing and the reality before them. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a father of 3 himself, approached Colonel Chen with growing concerns. "Ma'am, I'm not seeing anything that matches our intel report. These appear to be families seeking food assistance, not militia members." "Sergeant, our intelligence came through established channels. We maintain security protocols until the situation is fully assessed," Colonel Chen replied, though doubt had begun creeping into her own evaluation. By noon, Riverside District resembled an occupied territory. Military checkpoints controlled access to several blocks, forcing residents to show identification and explain their business in their own neighborhood. Local businesses closed as customers couldn't reach them. Schools in the area went into lockdown as a precaution. The economic impact rippled immediately. Restaurants and shops lost a full day's revenue. Workers couldn't reach their jobs. Public transportation was rerouted, affecting thousands of commuters across the city. The cost of Karen's lie was mounting by the hour. Meanwhile, Karen watched the news coverage from her office, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and growing unease. The response had exceeded even her expectations, transforming her moment of irritation into a citywide crisis. "Did you see the news about that militia thing in Riverside?" her business partner, Jennifer Walsh, asked during their afternoon meeting. "Apparently, it's some kind of organized domestic terrorism threat." "Really? That's right where I had a client appointment this morning," Karen replied, testing the waters of her deception. "I wondered why there were so many police cars." "The National Guard is there now. Can you imagine right here in our city?" Karen nodded gravely, but her stomach tightened as she realized the magnitude of what she had set in motion. Still, she rationalized. Perhaps now the authorities would address the problem of too many poor people gathering in public spaces. The first crack in her fabricated narrative appeared that evening. Lieutenant Danny Kim, a National Guard intelligence officer, had been reviewing drone footage captured throughout the day as part of standard documentation protocols. What he saw contradicted every aspect of the initial threat assessment. "Colonel, "I think we need to review this footage immediately," Lieutenant Kim reported, his voice tight with concern. "I'm not seeing any evidence of weapons, militia activity, or threatening behavior." The drone had captured hours of high-definition video, showing peaceful volunteers distributing food to orderly lines of families. No weapons were visible. No threatening gestures or aggressive behavior appeared anywhere in the footage. Instead, the recording showed elderly volunteers hugging children, young people helping carry groceries to cars, and Marcus directing operations with the efficiency of someone running a well-organized community service. "This looks like exactly what they said it was, a food bank," Colonel Chen observed, studying the footage with growing dismay. "Lieutenant, I want you to pull the original 911 call and cross-reference every detail with what we're seeing here." The investigation that followed unraveled Karen's lies with methodical precision. Phone records showed her call originated from outside the immediate area. Traffic cameras captured her BMW positioned to observe the food bank, but never surrounded or threatened. Most damning, the drone footage definitively proved that no weapons, aggressive behavior, or militia-style organization had ever existed. Detective Lisa Murphy, assigned to investigate the false report, felt her anger rising as she reviewed the evidence. "We've got a completely fabricated emergency call that deployed federal resources, shut down a neighborhood, and left thousands of families without food. This isn't a prank, it's domestic terrorism." As evening approached, 3 local news stations had arrived to cover the Riverside siege. Reporter Amanda Foster from Channel 7 News was among the first journalists to question the official narrative. "We're here in Riverside District where federal authorities have responded to reports of armed militia activity," she reported to camera. "However, what we're seeing appears to be families who came seeking food assistance from a community organization that has operated here peacefully for 8 years." Her live report included interviews with displaced families, frustrated volunteers, and neighbors who described the food bank as a cornerstone of community support. The contrast between the military response and the actual situation became increasingly stark as more journalists arrived. "Marcus Williams has been feeding families in this neighborhood since 2016, explained Reverend Patricia Adams, pastor of nearby Mount Olive Baptist Church. "He's probably prevented more violence through his work than any law enforcement operation ever could. This is heartbreaking." By 10 p.m., social media had shifted from fear to outrage as the truth emerged. The hashtag #Justice for Riverside began trending alongside videos of hungry children being turned away by armed soldiers. Community leaders across the city demanded answers. Karen watched the coverage from her living room, her earlier satisfaction replaced by mounting dread. The story was evolving beyond her control, and her role as the anonymous caller suddenly felt less like clever problem-solving and more like criminal liability. The breakthrough came the next morning when Detective Murphy's investigation team successfully traced Karen's phone records and cross-referenced them with traffic camera footage. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen had made a false emergency report that triggered a massive law enforcement response based entirely on fabricated information. "We have probable cause for charges of filing a false police report, misuse of emergency services, and potentially domestic terrorism under federal statutes." Detective Murphy briefed her captain. "The economic impact alone is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars." The arrest warrant was signed within hours. Karen was taken into custody at her office during what was supposed to be a routine Tuesday morning meeting with clients. The irony wasn't lost on Detective Murphy that Karen's own clients watched as she was handcuffed and read her rights. "Karen Elizabeth Whitman, you're under arrest for filing a false police report, misuse of emergency services, and conspiracy to incite public disorder. You have the right to remain silent. The booking photo that circulated within hours showed a woman whose carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. Karen's perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her professional makeup streaked with tears, and her eyes reflected the dawning realization of consequences she had never anticipated. The national news coverage that followed transformed the Riverside incident into a watershed moment in discussions about racial bias, police militarization, and the weaponization of emergency services. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and major networks all covered the story, though their interpretations varied significantly. This case illustrates how easily our emergency response systems can be manipulated by individuals with racial prejudice and personal grievances. Legal analyst Sarah Washington explained on national television, "A single phone call from someone who couldn't tolerate seeing Black people gather in their neighborhood mobilized federal resources designed to combat terrorism." The economic costs were staggering. The National Guard deployment alone cost taxpayers over $200,000. Lost business revenue in Riverside District exceeded $50,000. The overtime expenses for local police, federal agents, and support staff added another $100,000 to the tally. But the human cost was immeasurable. 3,000 families had gone without groceries for a week, while the food bank remained closed during the investigation. Children had attended school hungry. Elderly residents had skipped medications to afford food. Working parents had faced impossible choices between missing work to find food elsewhere or leaving their families without adequate nutrition. Marcus Williams became the reluctant face of the crisis, appearing on national television to discuss the broader implications of what had happened. His dignity and thoughtful responses provided a sharp contrast to the chaos that Karen's call had created. "What troubles me most isn't even what happened to us," Marcus told interviewer Anderson Cooper. "It's knowing that someone looked at families trying to feed their children and saw a threat that needed to be eliminated. That tells you something about where we are as a society." The legal proceedings against Karen moved swiftly. Federal prosecutors, facing intense public scrutiny, charged her under domestic terrorism statutes due to the scope and impact of her false report. Her bail was set at $50,000, which her family struggled to meet as her real estate business collapsed under the weight of negative publicity. "Your Honor, my client made a mistake, but she never intended for the response to escalate to this level," Karen's attorney argued during the bail hearing. "She's a mother and businesswoman with no prior criminal record." Counselor, your client's mistake deployed federal military resources against American citizens seeking food assistance. Federal Judge Robert Martinez replied sharply, "The intent may have been personal convenience, but the impact was community-wide terror." Bail is set at $50,000, and Ms. Whitman is prohibited from any contact with the Riverside District or anyone associated with the food bank. While Karen awaited trial, the Riverside community began healing and rebuilding. The negative publicity had an unexpected positive effect. Donations poured in from across the country. Within 2 weeks, the Hope Community Food Bank had received over $300,000 in contributions, allowing them to expand their services and establish satellite locations in 2 other underserved neighborhoods. "People saw what happened to us and decided they wanted to be part of the solution," Keisha Thompson explained as she coordinated the expanded operations. "We're now able to serve 5,000 families weekly instead of 3,000. Sometimes good comes from the worst situations." Major grocery chains and food distributors, embarrassed by the national attention highlighting food insecurity in their own communities, established permanent partnerships with the food bank. Corporate sponsors funded refrigerated trucks, allowing the organization to rescue and distribute fresh produce that would otherwise go to waste. The National Guard's involvement led to broader policy discussions about appropriate emergency response protocols. Colonel Chen, who had commanded the deployment, became an advocate for reforming the systems that had allowed a single false report to trigger such massive mobilization. "We need better intelligence verification before deploying federal resources," she testified before a congressional subcommittee investigating the incident. "Our response protocols were designed for genuine threats, not for managing the consequences of individual prejudice and false reporting." The trial proceedings revealed the full scope of Karen's deception. Prosecutors presented evidence showing she had researched domestic terrorism keywords before making her call, deliberately crafting language designed to trigger maximum law enforcement response. Her internet search history included queries about militia groups, domestic terrorism reporting, and police response protocols. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of poor judgment. Prosecutor Amanda Chen argued to the jury, "The defendant conducted research and made calculated decisions to weaponize our emergency response system against a community organization she personally found inconvenient." Karen's defense team attempted to portray her as an overwhelmed businesswoman who had genuinely misinterpreted what she saw. However, the drone footage, traffic camera evidence, and her own phone records contradicted every aspect of her original emergency call. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: filing false police reports, misuse of emergency services, inciting public panic, and domestic terrorism through false reporting. The domestic terrorism conviction, in particular, carried serious federal penalties. The defendant's actions terrorized an entire community and weaponized racial prejudice through our emergency response system. Judge Martinez stated during sentencing, "The court sentences Karen Elizabeth Whitman to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Additionally, the defendant will pay full restitution for all costs associated with the emergency response, totaling approximately $400,000. Karen's assets, including her house, business, and vehicles, were seized to cover restitution payments. Her real estate license was permanently revoked. Her family faced financial ruin and social ostracism that would follow them for years. But the most significant changes occurred in Riverside District itself. The community, that had been terrorized by Karen's false accusations, emerged stronger and more united than before. The food bank became a symbol of resilience, expanding its mission to include job training, childcare during distribution hours, and partnerships with local healthcare providers. Marcus Williams, thrust into national prominence he never sought, used his platform to advocate for policy changes that would prevent similar incidents. He testified before Congress, spoke at universities, and worked with civil rights organizations to address the systemic issues that had allowed Karen's prejudice to mobilize federal resources. What happened in Riverside wasn't really about one woman's phone call, Marcus explained to a packed auditorium at Howard University. It was about systems that are ready to believe the worst about Black communities and respond with overwhelming force before asking basic questions about what's actually happening. The policy changes that followed included mandatory verification protocols for domestic terrorism reports, community liaison requirements for federal deployments, and bias training for emergency dispatchers. Several cities implemented similar reforms proactively, hoping to avoid their own Riverside incidents. A year after the false emergency call, Riverside District hosted its first annual Community Resilience Festival, celebrating not just survival, but transformation. The food bank had evolved into a comprehensive community resource center. Local businesses had recovered and expanded. New families had moved into the neighborhood, attracted by its reputation for mutual support and civic engagement. Karen Whitman remained in federal prison, serving her sentence and facing the daily reality that her moment of prejudiced convenience had destroyed her own life while strengthening the community she had tried to harm. Letters from Riverside residents, including some from Marcus Williams himself, arrived monthly at the prison, not offering forgiveness, but providing education about the community she had never bothered to understand. The drone footage that had exposed her lies continued to be shown in criminal justice classes, civil rights workshops, and community organizing training sessions across the country. What was meant to document a terrorist threat instead captured something more powerful: ordinary people caring for each other with extraordinary dedication. On quiet mornings, when Marcus Williams unlocked the doors of the expanded Hope Community Food Bank and watched volunteers arrive with the same purposeful energy that had characterized the organization for years, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought national attention to their humble work. The tanks were gone, the soldiers had departed, and the news trucks had moved on to other stories. What remained was what had always been there: neighbors helping neighbors, families feeding families, and a community proving that resilience could triumph over hatred. The false call that was meant to destroy their work had instead amplified their mission across the nation. Thousands of communities had established their own food banks. Inspired by Riverside's example, millions of dollars in donations had flowed to organizations serving food insecure families. Policy changes had made emergency systems more accountable and less susceptible to manipulation by individual prejudice. In the end, Karen Whitman's attempt to weaponize the system against her neighbors had backfired completely. Her lie had been exposed, her life destroyed, and her intended victims empowered beyond anything they could have achieved without her unwitting assistance. Justice had been served not just through her conviction and imprisonment, but through the positive transformation of everything she had tried to tear down. As Marcus often told visitors to the food bank, sometimes the worst thing someone does to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to your community. We learned that our work matters more than we knew, that people across the country care about what we're doing, and that truth is always stronger than lies, even when the lies come with tanks and soldiers. The story of Riverside District became more than a cautionary tale about false emergency calls or racial prejudice. It became a testament to community resilience, the power of truth, and the possibility that even the most destructive acts of hatred could inadvertently create opportunities for healing, growth, and positive change that extended far beyond their original intended harm.